Hello everyone, today we talk about 11th century monasteries and groups of peoples that lived in them. We already saw in the past different groups. We looked at women, nuns, and also all these communities fundamentally that were coming, say, to live in between the space of the sacred and one of the world. And you know that the monastic principle is essentially to replicate in an ascetic direction the heavenly order on earth for the sake also just of osmotic, let's say, influence and imitation. That, of course, in Christianity has to do with the replication of the heavenly Jerusalem, the imitatio Christi, and so on. The 11th century we have approached also often, I would say. Last year especially we made multiple videos about this from the let's say from, of course, the side of the Gregorian reform, and so the gradual disciplining that these monastic communities underwent compared to early Christianity, early monasticism, that we have also seen, especially in the first years of Schwerpunkt, but we will come back to this, right? Because these are just all the various facets that compose the broader mosaic of the spiritual universe, and they must be taken in consideration quite carefully. From an individual perspective, because as you understand, there was always a moral tension, right? Sometimes teaching monastic history is difficult because not just, of course, people in general have lost contact with properly the concept of sacred and transcendence, and mistake a spirituality for something very different that mostly pertains to the world of their own emotions, not the process of disciplining them. But there is a also historical problem, I think. First of all, because we don't teach Christian history enough, right? I'm very surprised when here I will not open a digression on it, but you realize that the necessity of presenting an allegedly diverse reality in the past, given also that what we call as other religions were basically pursuing the same exact objective, just in different ways. It must be historically analyzed, but not that have something to do with what essentially Marxism has tried, failing, of course, to portray as a specific character of the West, right, Christianity, as just a sort of a weird thing that happened within this world and had or come from the East or Semitic past, and of course with the very specific aim of destroying the awareness on the imperial Catholic universal doctrine that was present pretty much everywhere, and actually in Europe, no doubt of the Christian origins in the East, but was especially revived in ways that pertain, in fact, massively to the traditional past. That was basically, again, the same thing that Christianity was just interpreting by different degrees, but being the same exact identical religion. And most people that in fact also approach the topic from the other side would pretend it was a sort of paganism before, and then Christianity arrived. It was something diametrically opposite in substance and in form. I think have severe cultural problems. Of course, we live in a world, again, in which the standard is the mass, right? It's the point of reference, the measure, the standard is the mass, right? And of course, the mass is a self-referential also in its moral inferiority, and as such, anything that can entail the need of improving oneself from the realization that just the way you are basically nothing, and you should be ashamed for, because you're a fallen kind, and without work you cannot accomplish anything, of course must go against what also, say, the Christian Middle Ages and Christianity in general, for what it was, also in perspective to the previous millennia actually embodied, right? And there is no doubt that there is, according to old tradition and also the same Christianity that says that essentially before the second coming of Christ, Satan will have to rule on earth, of course, a fall towards the abyss, right? That was shared by everyone. Again, it was the same identical religion for everyone, in that specifically refers to essentially what we are witnessing also today all over the world, right? This is not a problem of specific cultures or, let's say, of broader, let's say that this people, this countries, this religion is better or worse. This is like a global, universal, absolute dimension that entails, say, involves everyone in the process, because we are all interdependent, by the way, on each other, and the further disgregation of the wall, of course, is just the product of the distancing from the unitary wall. And it's funny to see how people fundamentally delude themselves that anything that pertains to an earthly dimension has anything to do with the sacred. But again, we are in that phase. We are in a pretty advanced Iron Age, and so we are, pretty ahead in the level of the generation, and that's exactly what you would like to expect, right? Finding false idols everywhere, internally, externally, whatever, and essentially pretending that you can be satisfied with that. So explaining 11th century monasticism in many ways is is understanding, of course, what this tension was felt like at that point in history, and also compare essentially the way we are now, right? Today, we're not discussing this in a broader, universal sense. I will make other history of Christianity videos also as far as the traditional meaning is concerned. We have a lot to dig in that direction. I know that you particularly like those topics. Today, we look just at some aspect of the mechanism, because as I was saying before, the most difficult problems are not even, of course, framing this will thing correctly, but also explaining to, let's say, today's teenagers essentially why would people choose monastic life in the Middle Ages. How can a kid nowadays have essentially any cultural, moral, or personal reference to why that would be a thing, right? We're losing it even about World War II. We're losing it about much more, daily life issues that were considered. You can see, interestingly enough, in the acceleration of the degeneration, of course, how just by, biological proximity, how, I don't know, even just your grandparents would see the world, and you can perfectly see the trail there in perspective. Well, just imagine studying, of course, much more back in time, seeing the thing much more clearly and knowing how to give a dimension like a compass, like using a compass to the whole thing for where you stand, right? And so that's why, of course, why we study history, even in these aspects that people may think, this is priestly stuff, boring. For example, I immediately know that this video will never get, I'm habituated, I don't think even tries the views that, I don't know, the one about tribes and peoples will get, because of course, again, the audience just doesn't even know what we're talking about here, and not even about the other topics for that matter, and that's why it's easier for them to bond with the concepts that, again, they think I'm discussing, but that they haven't the palest idea of what they actually mean and what I'm actually, in fact, explaining them like. This has really been a huge problem so far, because it's as if you always had everything under your eyes, but you stop reading through it, right? And that's basically what, that decline really looks like concretely. In any case, we have seen different figures, as far as the monastic reforms, just even the average monk, or even other figures that were involved in politics as much as in monastic affairs and so on. Today we'll look a bit more at what the average person could be, right? Or some group some age groups, for example, were concerned, and or why they decided to enter the monasteries, given their background, and especially what options were there in terms, for example, of living, say, in the monastery, but not being necessarily a monk, which also occurred, as we will see now. So we can start actually from the elderly, which is a very interesting topic, given the aforementioned need of salvation, because essentially you arrive at the end of your life, and as we will see, this applies also to younger people, especially in those times. And of course, you are concerned with the problem of salvation that can hardly be, accomplished, apparently. And if you've ever attended a mass, you perfectly know, even in Christian language, that's pretty clear, right? Most people think that, in fact, that's the point. Christianity is simply telling you, just have faith in Jesus, and then you will save yourself, or at least God will save you, because you've been good. This is not truly how it works, right? This is, first of all, there is a hope in that especially in Catholicism, that is the actual deal of Christianity, and all that came later basically broke with any traditional connection with the concept that you can actually have a control on your own salvation. Of course, it led straight away to atheism, especially, in fact, in countries that have abandoned Catholicism the earliest. For other reasons, of course, then tell the reason why were those countries that abandoned them. But let's say it's pretty clear that there is just a hope. Let's say there is a collective effort, which is the one of the church. Existing, blessed by the Holy Ghost, so essentially, as we've seen, the same imperium given to those who are able to control, in fact, the earth, and in this sense, there cannot quite be anything outside of it. And bear in mind what this means in terms of also traditional meaning, because today, again, we will not make history of Christianity, but if you wonder why also the church still exists the way it does, consider where has any sacred universal empire gone to this point, right? That's a question you should ask yourself. And the criticism that Christianity moved also against, in fact, what the Roman Empire had become by a degree, is the same one that we're living dramatically nowadays. That is to say, there is by far no power, right? There are powers that are more powerful than others, and that have earned that in the full wake of Western civilization, so hardly any fake imitation from kind of subcultures living in the surroundings. But it's still a level, yes, of fallen reality that has just for a while been able to control part of the world, and hardly not from the standpoint that a sacred empire, and also in the connection with previous Catholic ones, such as the Roman one, is actually connected with. So the idea, of course, is that if you practice in a certain ascetic fashion, you nourish fundamentally your awareness of the world and of the human condition of your faith, there can be a syntony with the universal order that may bring to a sanctity, and therefore to a transfiguration. This is a very delicate topic because, of course, it gets into the annihilation of the earthly dimension, right? And that's why it's so complicated, because the entire reason why Christianity came about is that the world had arrived to a point in which nobody basically had been able anymore to save oneself alone. And so what Christianity really did was to stress the necessity of this spiritual dimension before the merely earthly one. That is to say, you can have standards in the world, but hardly anybody's truly a God, the sole God on earth, because that would simply mean things that are evidently not there, right? And or that maybe got very close to that, and that surely were accomplished because of God's will, but that always kept the doubt on the whole thing. So what chances does have a person to save his or herself in this context is very it's an unanswerable question, even within Christianity, that uses essentially some metaphors to explain that in many ways we're screwed up, right? Even though Jesus died exactly for allowing us to be saved, which is not that different actually from what the entire deal also of say the previous religion really was, which was again the same thing, but Christianity just stressed mostly the medium, and so the separation between heaven and earth. But it was just the product of its times. It wasn't, let's say, different in the substance from that, again, terrifying step of transfiguration that had to occur just through in fact, a godlike effort. And that's the entire meaning that you find just in what you call erroneously as paganism, as much as in Christianity, and that you of course erroneously try to separate because you don't even understand what they mean anymore. But and that's where essentially the church comes into play as the Church of God, and where that Holy Ghost can in fact process that that passage in ways that of course are just a mystery of faith, and that in this sense tell you already that humans do not have really a shortcut to get through, and they have just to mostly again be right rather than good people, and hoping that this would be enough by a degree. But it didn't change what the whole point of the thing is. That is to say, even reaching that 50%, which is not enough for salvation, that is basically the only thing you can aspire to, if you actually have an awareness of the absolute power of God. First of all, again, it's not enough, but it's so distant from any standard any human being has ever had. You can argue, but even just in current times, I would like you to point to me who would be up to those standards. It's something pretty pretty dark after all. So we celebrate the possibility of it happening, but it's still up to us, right? And so even though also again in paganism you couldn't be saved without God's intervention, this occurred because you essentially became one with God yourself. So it was literally an heroic enterprise that, in fact, not even heroes, as a matter of fact, mostly were able to achieve. If you have an idea of essentially the way that they normally died, even in the sagas, in the myths, because they were always fundamentally paying for a sin that they had committed at some point. So this is maybe not the right mood starter for the video, but you have to understand that when you die and you're aware that this is the mechanism that occurs, and if you are not saved, you basically disappear, right? There will be no more of you, right? And even Shakespeare talked about this. What do you think that to be or not to be is, right? There is the literal question: is it so bad just to vanish and not bothering yourself too much in this still miserable existence for something that you will not be able to accomplish anyway? This is a huge question. It already reflects, of course, what the early modern age had become in terms of the refusal of traditional values for what they really were meant to be, right? And it looks at the crisis of the individual. It's something that you can find as late as Dostoevsky's works and beyond, right? It's just that today nobody tells you straight in the face. Well, for a long time, not even in these nearer times, but it's dramatically what it gets down to. So when you freak out in the expectation of your own death, and this happens the more, of course, you live, the longer you live, you wanna essentially hope to earn a place in heaven. And say many people in medieval times, of course, were already, of course, distanced from the awareness that such a thing could happen simply by that it could happen, say, through your own divine deeds, essentially, and or divine worth deeds. Let's see. And so they tended, of course, to dimension it in the way they hoped would be enough, right? Which is, again, what every human eventually does in a way or another. Because again, unless you actually make it and you know you're making it, in that case, you're not making it. So you try to compromise in some way or another. So elderly people often entered monasteries in the 11th century, and either as full members or as pensioners, known as Prebendaries, and later as Corodians. Right, the Corodians were in essence just pensioners who lived in the monasteries or nunneries, as we've seen also with an important female participation. And as we'll see, they were usually well-to-do elderly lay people who actually paid or were sponsored for accommodation and food for the rest of their lives here. Their payment could be cash, but also donating land to the abbey in question. Of course, as we will see, this was still occurring for some of the, in fact, more affluent individuals, because the monasteries were theirs, but it's not just a matter of property owner, right? There were like people like in 11th century just also earning money and affording that kind of, after all, short period before their death being spent in the monastery. And as you understand, the monks had to take care of you, but you had somehow prepaid such service. So this is quite interesting, because if you think the pretty dark and sad ways old people die nowadays, like even separated from their families in places where you can't even enter, because maybe it's they get COVID and by law you can't enter, you can't even visit them, whatever. And so in a space that doesn't quite care particularly of them per se, right? Of course, you can think that in the 11th century may have been similar, but at least the question was framed in a much more specific context that was exactly the one of preparing yourself to the passing in a way that this sense the entire local community participated to, considering the highest possible transcendental aim, and that thus also prepared the same people living there to the same dimension. Was part of their ascetic experience, right, to witness life and death in these ways. There were also people who, nearing death, took the monastic habit in a way called ad succurrendum, that is to say, entering a religious order upon just one's deathbed, right? So this had a long story in the Middle Ages, and to a large extent it would be taken care by the mendicants later on, but it was already a thing here, and it was consolidating. This is part of what we were saying before, right? It was a sort of repentance for sins, and so the idea is that if you had literally predisposed your soul at that point to with that shock of reality, of realizing that it's all transient, you're going to pass, and that everything earthly is practically just an illusion in terms of worth and value, purpose, you could reach that kind of, okay, I repent of my sins, God save me, and so allegedly that would have been enough. They believed partly in this, or at least they tried, right? And so that was the point, a bit like Pascalian, bet, like, I don't believe in it, but if if there is a God, let's try it, please, because what we have to lose. With the exception that at the time they really actually believed it much more than in the 17th century, as you understand, where only those ideas could be formulated for the first time in a philosophical sense. It was still a Christian one, considered that, right? So they actually believed it in it. Also, Pascal, he has an interesting background, but the point being that assisting the entry into the next world was still part of that imitation, which the entire monastic deal was about. Right, you had essentially to render people aware of the transcendental dimension of the sacred, and thus going even just in a monastery to die is a way to identify in the place as provided with some higher meaning, right? You hardly think so when you think of a monastery, just think about monks staying there isolated, that's it, but it had a major civilizational impact, and by this point it was already pretty well firm. It was being intensified, as you know, through the High Middle Ages. There was an incredible spread of monastic organization. Now, the status, however, of the people who would enter the monastery in the aforementioned ways was relatively uncertain, or at least it varied from monastery to monastery, because again, these standards were very often heterogeneous before, especially Gregorian reforms, but properly different eras of Europe were habituated to different things, and so on. So it would take centuries before this thing was truly uniformed. In any case, there is always also a degree of autonomy, discretion, of specificity, depending on the same individual. So it's never about like just like a factory-like approach, but we're talking about a person's soul, and so something that really must be guided in a serious and personalized way. And the main differences stood in, for example, whether these people were to take the habit or not, right? This is to say, whether or not they were professed. Also, where they died. Being professed means literally that you have made your profession. That is, to have committed yourself to the monastic status. You could make a simple, that is temporary one, or a solemn final one, and so depending on this, the greater was the commitment and the type of their journey in the monastery. There was a problem, however, that arose when the sick or wounded person that had entered the monastery, so expecting to die, had taken his vows and subsequently recovered. Right, so that was a big deal because, as we've seen, there was a different degree of commitment, and of course, in times of great peril, people would commit themselves entirely. But once they recovered, they not just wanted to come back to their life. In some cases, not always, but they had also contributed to a degree. Right, we can't think their families had paid something for them, because mostly these were people who were about to die, so they also were in conditions normally in which they couldn't really take care of the whole matter, and that meant thus that this person had to go away, or at least he could even, or she could even stay in that case at the expenses of the monasteries, but this still entailed some kind of economic problem, as you understand. And also, just the moral one, the implication, if you have now professed for the rest of your life, and this is going to be longer than you expect, and you want to actually come back to your previous one because things went differently from how you thought on your deathbed, that wouldn't happen. There was a major moral issue about that. For example, a monk ad succurrendum at Mont Saint-Michel in 1075 gave up the habit, but left the gift he had given to the monastery, reserving the right to enter it again whenever he wished. So it was just like booking, right? Reserving a room in a hotel by a degree, like saying, I've paid you a lot, right? Because the contribution could be not just about the your maintenance, let's say your the costs of making you live there, but it could be just, again, you think you're dying, let's pay a lot the monastery, so hopefully God will save us better when we die. And of course, sometimes this was a lot of stuff, and it could be like, once the monks had received it, it was difficult to retrieve it because, it was a donation, a spontaneous one, and just monasteries were protected all by a certain degree of privileges and so on. So you couldn't quite ask for it back. There could be agreements about that, perhaps, but this seemed convenient. That is to say, in the case you were to die again, which in those times was also happening sooner than you probably expected, as also this near-death experience had proven you could simply count on the monastery that would remind, of course, of your donation, and would have, also the interest of being fair about it, because still, again, there was a competition among monasteries also about this. It was a way to just make their own amount of income for the community and so on. Naturally, these weren't the only forms they profited, but it was, again, a community that lived in the world and had also political connections, as we will see, sometimes even through people that lived within the monastery, right? So it was important just to have a high standards also from a moral point of view, because that was the entire point of the monastery in the first place. Otherwise, people would have not chosen it to die. Sorry, well, of course, you can think of proximity, but there were many monasteries to this point, and they really were expanding fast, also in number and in power and in articulation and in space, even just for welcoming these people. Canon law would later establish that a canon was ill and gave himself to an abbot as a monk, and brother must remain a monk, right? Because there was no other way, basically, to come back from it. Would have lowered the standards of the same monastery, of the same morals, right, of the time, right? How you approach a monastery with the intentions, again, of professing, of being convinced that with those absolute standards we were talking about before, they are the only possible one for hoping for salvation, and you just say, okay, sorry, I had enough there, to want to go out. Well, it could happen for many reasons, of course, but it was still conceived as an infraction, and had you had to come back to a monastery for the same reason, you would have been prevented from actually make a new profession, and thus also your status in front of God in this sense would have resented all of it, because you were not fully within the monastic community, and thus you were somehow dangerously distant from the standards that you wanted to achieve. But that was on you, evidently. There is another thing to consider, though, that is to say that most of the people who, like the Prebendaries, for example, that decided to enter monastery expecting their near death, were in effect old age pensioners. So what we see from the practice is that they were normal people that were aging, that were just even entering monasteries. We'll see it in other videos for many reasons, not just because they thought they were dying at that point or in the near future, but that just wanted to make that choice and wanted to pass, with all the due care and providing the monastery with the means to sustain them, and thus doing all in the good way, in the functional, effective way. In the most traditional religious houses, however, the community was importantly divided between two groups. Ones were the Conversi, the converts, that is, those who had entered the monastery as adults, right? And the other group were instead the members who came as children, and thus were known as oblates, so properly given because by their parents, right? Albeit there could be also the so-called Nutriti, that were a sort of orphans, because they were literally nourished and raised in the community just per se, right? And both the Conversi and the Nutriti were, however, full members of the community. Converts were usually uneducated at the time of their entry, thus also ignorant of the ways of monastic lives. The reason being that these were just, again, Norman laymen who had at a point decided to enter the monastery. Of course, they had not lived there before. They were, as most people at the time, illiterate, and they hadn't received essentially any formal education. While the monks, as you understand it, entered as children, oblates, and also the Nutriti, knew their letters and details of monastic discipline and liturgy, as they literally had been raised there. A point, though, is that though the children who had, in fact, been raised within the monastery had no knowledge of life outside the monastery in general, because the idea of monks not traveling or not being exposed to the outer world, first of all, is against properly the monastic principle of imitatio Christi. So the Christian world has always to interact with monks, to see what they do, etc. And of course, at this point, there would be an increased chance of being not just like an isolated, say, community in the early Middle Ages with a relatively, more, say, monotonous lifestyle. At this point, these monasteries were organized also in orders. Let's say, at least they were all thinking to be Benedictines, but they had different, say, updated rules in that regard. They were acting in concert with the great powers of the time. So they had at least, of course, a knowledge of the outer world, but not necessarily in a relational sense, or in a deep kind of with a deep kind of awareness. They preferred, they saw the monastery as their house, the community as their family. So they just had a different attitude, right? The problem of this is that whenever the monastery needed to, in fact, perform some missions, to exchanges, diplomatic, activities, such monks raised just from childhood in the community were, say, psychophysically different. Thus, they could be spent in different ways, mostly internally, right? And were not apt to the outer world. However, there was also another problem that some of them, exactly because they had just been brought there, right, by their parents, or they had been adopted by the monks, were not necessarily inclined, or they wouldn't grow up, but this could happen with the oblates as well. They may not show a predisposition towards monastic life, right? So they could be difficult. For example, Ulrich von Speyer, in his preface of his Customs of Cluny, that are written towards the 80s of the 11th century, remarks on these, in fact, poor creatures who were given to the monastery, quote, not for the sake of God, but because essentially their parents had not wanted them at home, right? Which was just a way to send children in a college, right? So, of course, in the 11th century, you can imagine all the type of life. Of course, it was an advantage in just being a monk, considering that even before this time, we weren't, even after the Gregorian reforms, I mean, the moral standards were not necessarily so rigid as far as properly life choices were concerned. Of course, these were places of work, of silence. The Benedictine rule, aside from the songs, of course, was pretty clear about properly a kind of Spartan discipline of sort. But there were people who just moved from monastery to monastery at some points, but also just because of administrative reasons of career. They had children, etc. So the idea perhaps of some parents was, okay, let's simply send them to the monastery, and then not so much will happen if they want to remain there, okay. This could be even an advantage in terms of social promotion, etc. This doesn't mean they will not have sort of life on their own, or if they want, they can simply leave, right? And that may have been a problem, as we've seen before, because they may have committed themselves at some point, also in the later age, right, and not being fully convinced, having psychological problems of sort. This was normal, of course, in the various, and that's why the discipline existed in the first place. Because it was a challenging choice, right? So converts usually were preferred to the Nutriti, especially as monastic officials, because they were both people of the world, fundamentally, as they had lived their previous life up to adulthood or during it outside, right, of the monastery. And they knew also how to handle some broader political, administrative affairs. Whereas the Nutriti were, generally speaking, like even as orphans, devoid of a true, sometimes, of course, of a true, commitment. They were difficult types, and just having lived within the monastery themselves were just ignorant of the outer world, right? Whereas the oblates were instead more aware of what they were doing. They had been prepared by their parents to do so. Maybe some of them had showed an inclination since, in fact, an early age for monastic life, and so they were more motivated. They had seen what a family was. They had seen what the outer world was in terms of hierarchy, values, and so on. But as we'll see now, the church also will increasingly prefer, the entering in monastery as adults, right, rather than as children. The children, however, were also sent sometimes to the monastery for a limited amount of time to study there. Right? I made some videos about the difference between early and high medieval education, and you've seen that basically it was easier, paradoxically, for those who would have thought the say a literary education to be useful to enter such studies in the early Middle Ages rather than in the high ones, where there was more competition, there were more standards, right? And naturally also this education was more structured and so required more effort. And it was, of course, more remunerative. There was more selection, right? So you also had probably to be better. You had to be the smarter element, hopefully. It wouldn't work, of course, always like that. Not probably even in the majority of cases. But the point was not much about the predisposition, but of course of how you could cultivate these souls over time. And as you know, there were extraordinary talents emerging from these worlds. The Cluniac Priory of Succurrendum, where Peter the Venerable spent his youth as an oblate, educated boys up to the ages of 7 or 10, both in the main house and the dependencies of the monastery, and sometimes with the understanding that if a boy died, another could be sent in his place. Of course, childhood mortality was very high, as you know, and these centers cared about, of course, providing with an important degree of education in exchange, of course, for even there a payment. A certain amount of goods were donated to the monastery just to maintain the children by their parents. So there was also an idea of making them come in a way that could be manageable but also profitable for everyone involved. It happened that children could come to the monastery together with their parents, especially in some of the new houses in the 11th century. For example, Amadeus of Haute-Rève entered Bonneveau with his son and later went to Cluny for the sake of the boys' education. Right? This is interesting because it's as if, you know, the family had remained just in the monastery altogether. All right, and it tells you also how varied these communities were. Of course, just think what it means to grow up in these environments, and where again in the 11th century everything was relatively it was organized and disciplined and all, but it was also experimental, right? Was new by some degree what kind of lifestyle to pursue. There were variations in this regard. At Aubazine, boys stayed with their mothers in the house for women until they were 5 years old, when they were transferred to the boys' part of the men's monastery. And this is quite interesting too, because again, it's a sort of there were many women who, especially after, say, I don't know, they remained widows, they would want to enter a monastery, but they had children, so they could enter with them, sometimes becoming monks themselves, and or, you know, this depended on the families, of course, where they were coming from, what were their intentions. But just to make you understand here what the type of of monastic that comes from monad, from the idea that you have to be somehow isolated, or you have to concentrate just on what the monastery means per se, would bring to probably a different worldview. One small boy who had never left the women's house in Aubazine did not know what women were, because he was too little to remember, and thus was convinced by a monk as a joke that women were goats, like that stayed out there in the field somewhere. And that was, of course, just think of what could come from that. Of course, it would be interesting to study from a psychological point of view what the consequences of this really were, because as you understand, these were, there was just an internal control most of the time, so they could be dangerous places as well. But it was part of the, if you want, even of the camaraderie of it, right? The idea that there had to be a selection, even an abuse, in order to make these people toughen up, just as we've seen, for example, in the brotherhoods of warriors and so on. There were military men even here. So, of course, they were much milder communities, but consider that once you were in, well, in the 11th century, you were literally there, right under someone else. And the situation could be, like, just imagine you didn't want just to be there in the first place, as it could be the case. In any case, it became increasingly common in the 11th and 12th century to refuse children as either oblates or even students. The reason being, as we'll see now, that children were thought to be like, indisciplined enough, right? They wouldn't essentially fit the disciplinary standards of a monastery, right? And as you understand, before the Reformation, also the monasteries had become, as we've just seen, a place where many people lived, even with intentions that were not aimed at maintaining particularly high spiritual standards, just per se, not necessarily moral ones, but still. And the nuns of Forest-les-Bruxelles, for example, were forbidden to have, quote, a multitude of children and little girls, whose, quote, girlish levity might destroy the nun's sanctity. And this was part of the whole, you may just wonder, of course, of the various reasons why this was issued. Even in here, could have been part of the same abuse, but probably was literally of the fact that, especially the multitude of these children, that is to say, why are you taking them? Is this like an excess? Is this just because you want to make, to receive more money, right, essentially, and just keeping this children, just looking after them, rather than concentrating on monastic life? Well, that was a danger, a peril, concretely. The age of entry was commonly set at somewhere between 15 or 20, thus. Which is interesting, because at that time, it's when you become an adult, practically. And people aged much faster than today. And which seemed okay, because you were essentially able to take decisions in an age also in which you have a broader, almost religious mentality on your own, independently from, ages or cultures. And Peter the Venerable decreed that no novice should become a monk at Cluny until he was 20, owing to, quote, the immature and excessively speedy reception of children who were clothed with the vestments of religion before they could have any rational intelligence. This is a crucial statement that actually shows pretty well what the moral, increasing moral standards of the monastic institutions really was. This is from the Statuta number 36, by the way. So it was properly laid out, like, children are oblated for essentially reasons that have nothing to do with the spiritual standards of the monastery, and thus they cannot become monks until 20, which, as we were saying before, is also kind of a late age for those times, right? It's not that, again, humans changed enormously over time, but the idea is that 20 years old at the time was you were full-grown man, right? So doesn't matter how young you were, you must have cultivated some kind of inclination for the monastic life, and also a broader rationale, as Peter the Venerable says, to be there in the first place. Like, you have to be sure of this commitment that often was also for life, right? So this preventing various problems from simply by simply stopping children to be accepted in the monasteries as for their future life as monks, staying from their mindset changed, the fact that some were forced, as we've seen, against their will, right? You say, of course, it was a brutal discipline as well, because evidently for such note to have been written in the statute, you probably knew that there were lots of children were just forced, also by the same monasteries that had essentially an interest, right, to even just also transform these individuals passively into monks, like not in fact dealing with adults, but coercing the children together with their parents to remain monks, right? So the thing existed at the time, because again, many children were sent there just because some of their families wanted to concentrate the father's inheritance in just fewer children, and similar things, right? So this could there are pieces of literature from this time telling how the monastic choice was forced, as much as sometimes how much parents had control, even just over those children who or kids that wanted to become monks, or also just other part of the clergy actually, and were prevented from doing so, right? So it's full of cases of that. And so the idea that just the simple inclination towards this word was not enough until you were mature enough is fascinating, because it shows that after all the system worked, had recognized that it wasn't a positive thing to keep things going that way. Before the 12th century, considered this oblation was considered irreversible. And there had been disputes at very high level concerning this topic. In fact, the same Urban II Pope held that a vow made by a child, even in ignorance, was valid, while Pope Alexander III decreed that the religious habit taken by a boy under 14 years old was invalid. This is also interesting, and consider that the Gregorian reform had brought with itself, of course, the possibility of the popes fundamentally to in fact modify the rules established by their predecessors, which wasn't a thing before. Thus, this evidently reflects the organizational and, at the end of the day, political problems that stood behind these issues, because it's not that the popes necessarily, they may have had their own personal idea regarding to some experience. Consider, as you know, monks were distant from the secular clergy, just from a cultural point of view. There was even a rivalry, but it was important to not to alienate the sympathies of the institutions, and the thing is much more complex than it really seems, right? This decisions may be dictated just by common sense, but evidently it wasn't the thing, right? It just depended on what kind of policy you wanted to pursue, with which communities, at which stage of monastic establishment, and so on. And this during the Gregorian reforms, the investiture controversy, etc., was a big deal every time. So even popes had to be careful with the consequences of such apparently, uncontroversial decisions. As a consequence of these papal establishment, the members of most religious communities by the 12th century had grown up in a sense, and had been educated, by the way, in the secular world. Many had been married, which normally happened, in fact, much earlier than today, or at least also they had some sexual experience. So there were persons of the world, generally speaking. This was an advantage. They entered religious life not owing to a decision made by their parents or in expectation of death, but as a result of their, in fact, experience of the world, and thus also coming with, for monastic history, with different attitudes and expectations than in the past, right? And consequently also more elevated ones, right? More insightful ones, and just not making the monasteries as some sort of resort, right, for just escaping the world. And bear in mind that again, there were advantages in a world characterized by war, right? Most males out there would have had to go to war at some point in their life. Some were knights. There were also many knights that retired after a life of bloodshed. We've seen the monastic military orders, but also in regular kind of monastic communities. But considering the isolation epidemics, for the nuns, considered women died of infection after birth, childbirth, and so on. So it was a pretty brutal existence out there, and just living in a essentially in a sheltered reality very often also. So from a military point of view, monasteries, the most powerful ones, had military retinues. They were protected, as we've seen, by lords of different kind, right? So it was sort of investment in your well-being, after all. And for many people, even just by inclination, this was kind of a positive choice, right? It was better, and surely some lived better in the monastery than they lived outside. And coming also from relatively poor backgrounds, by the way. So consider that in terms also of, if you think you have some important moral inclination towards spiritual life, and you don't have but that, well, the entire Christian philosophy is that's what matters, not necessarily wealth, power, and so on, per se, right? In terms of quite material way, right? So, as we were saying before, it became actually relatively more difficult to enter the monastery, given the selection that increased over time, because as we've seen, these people now in their 20s were also, generally speaking, better accepted if they were, in fact, already educated, right? So it's obvious that they would have sort of privilege in that choice, in that selection, than others. But this was also a way to boost civilization further, because the better the monastic communities, the more, of course, the benefit to the entire system. And we're talking about the 11th to 12th century moments, as you know, of enormous consolidation of properly European civilization through also the monasteries and all the roles they perform. And we will see, of course, in other videos, because these are just tiny bits of a broader wall. I think it's important to mention that by the mid 11th century, a new type of member appeared. This was the what would become later this named the lay brother. Right. This started first of all in Italy, in ascetic communities such as the Hermitage of the Camaldoli. We'll absolutely have to make a video on, because we still haven't. And later, only later, north of the Alps, but not only in new houses, also in the old monasteries, as even Cluny, which at that point were seeking to reduce their dependence on lay servants. What was the role of these lay brothers? Well, as we just said, monasteries had tended to, employ a number of laymen, right, of different sorts. These could be administrators. They could be literally even those who illuminated the manuscripts, those who sculpted, the decorations in the cloisters. They could be also just people who had to do with the assets of the monastery per se. As you know, monasteries were lordships on their own. They had land, and they had a seigneury over the peasantry that worked for them, and they couldn't quite. They depended on the broader secular ecclesiastical hierarchy, by the way, but they still needed, for practical purpose, some connection with the outer world, right? And this posed problems because it was a way to also infringe, in part, the monastic space with a word coming in that was always seen as, contaminating, kind of bringing the evil in, bringing the devil, right? And so the entire purpose of the monastery instead was maintaining that absolute concentration. So accepting essentially these lay brothers in the community, so within the monastery, and making them do stuff, that by essentially making them live like the monks, but not making them be monks as the others and sending them out, was a way to compromise and to grow also autonomous in the disposability of these people, right? Like the old Conversi, the lay brothers joined the community as adults, right? But they remained, so they were properly selected, and they remained a distinct group occupied with the management of external affairs of the community. The only point, again, it was that they couldn't become monks themselves. They were set off from the monks, not only by their way of life, which was disciplined in a different way, but also by their clothing and beards, which were a mark of their lay status. At Hirsau, they were called lay or bearded conversi to distinguish them from the religiosi monachi. And at Savigny, they were the laymen whom they call conversi, and who served God, quote, under the habit of religion. Right, so there was a mixture here, because as you understand, they were even sometimes identified with saying conversi, right? So there were different layers, different, as we've seen, different single monastic traditions about how to cope with these individuals internally, how to discipline them, how to consider them, what were their prerogatives, and so on. The Cistercian order adopted the lay brothers probably in the 20s of the 12th century. Innocent II, in his bulls for Citeaux and Pontigny, specifically refers to them as, to those monasteries, your conversi, who are not monks, right? So even at a papal level, there was de facto the the usage of this term now, as more the conversi were usually this kind of people who do not come through the regular selection that, as we've seen, would make them come just as laymen, but as young people, as people who had just maybe had even married, etc., but that were still young enough to be considered like introducible in the order as literal monks. This naturally depended also on the individual choice. I mean, you could enter as a monk also later on in your life, as we've seen, but you could choose not to be a monk, yet to live in the monastery itself, which is an interesting solution when it recalls the Beguines, the other groups that later would, especially in the cities, in the 11th to 12th centuries, overwhelmingly still a more agricultural reality, right? So, but that would live in the city, but with also monastic urban monasteries that are typical again of the mendicant orders. Made multiple videos about that, and thus that are also very different from what monastic life was before this time, right? And changing a lot of, especially in the relations between the bishops and the monks in the cities and so on. These previous times, instead, was still about going literally out there in the monastery, somewhere that was somehow isolated, right? Not living in the heart of the city, right? And dealing with different problems as a consequence. Here we're looking at essentially at French, German, Italian examples. Yeah, I mean, all these countries had their isolated monasteries, mostly coming from Hermetism. You know that, especially the Apenninic communities brought much of the elements that would carry out the reform. In France and Germany, there were wide areas that were still properly not that were not urbanized, that were good places where the monasteries could even properly just expand. The many uncultivated areas at this point are reclaimed, are put into exploitation. The same Cistercians, as you know, were masters in this kind of properly territorial expansion. So it's a slightly different world than it would become at the time of the mendicant orders. But we will see these comparisons perhaps in another video. However, exactly because of this ambiguity and this compromise that the lay brothers embodied, often there were problems arising from their presence. For example, sometimes they revolted. Yes, they were, they wanted to live essentially their own way, evidently making a sort of group against the monks within the same monastery, and this was a big deal, right, for the internal order, the heavenly order of the place. However, they were still functional because they represented a series of forts, especially at the beginnings of, in their beginnings, to free religious houses from the especially economic dependence on lay workers. Again, anything you had to do before in the monastery that you didn't have enough manpower, skills, etc. for, you had to call people from the outside. Instead, these lay brothers, who evidently had also some qualities as far as the profession that they had, and that just their lifestyle could afford them to do, were more directly controllable by the monastery under which they technically were, and thus they were a resource to especially, in fact, administrate the monastery and its possessions in ways that would be properly more independent, because it's obvious that whoever the lay people that they took to work in the monastery were they could also depend on a lord, for example, having different interests and so on. Instead, here it's a huge phase of expansion, and the monastery wants to strengthen, to structure, to consolidate as properly a fully autonomous body that can undertake important initiatives just with its own manpower. And at the same time, this was still a huge opportunity for whoever wanted to enter the institution, leading to a consecrated life of some sort for many men and women who might otherwise have been unable to do so as monks and nuns, right? Again, prefiguring those tertiary orders of later times that were always in this direction, practically the same thing, albeit yes, in a different context. In any case, we will observe in other videos also what were a bit introspectively, psychologically, the motivations. Also quite practically, right? Telling the truth and rationally. That would bring people to choose monastic life at the time, because as I was saying at the beginning of the video, that's the most important aspect, right? Some reasons, as we have listed, were trivial. It was just a way to live better by some degree, or to have a better life than the one you would have had outside. But it was also concretely a matter of faith, a matter of spiritual tension and necessity, and or say other reasons that would help us understanding much better what medieval mentality really was on the base of. However, we will see this another time. For today, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I thank you heartily, as always, for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.